Logic had ruled 1,000 worlds, but the Force answered to no equation. When a stranger appeared aboard a dying rebel transport, his calm voice cutting through the chaos of turbolaser fire and failing shields, no one understood what had arrived. He spoke of probabilities where others spoke of hope. He calculated survival where Jedi had once trusted destiny. The Empire hunted with fire and fear, but this war would demand something neither side had prepared for, a mind that could see the patterns beneath the chaos, yet still choose to believe. Can reason survive in a galaxy where faith moves mountains and darkness devours the unwary? The battle above Hoth had turned the stars into shrapnel. Rebel transports scattered across the void like seeds thrown to solar wind, their ion trails fading against the black as star destroyers emerged from hyperspace in perfect geometric formation. The Empire had learned patience. They no longer rushed. They simply closed the net, segment by segment, until escape became a mathematical impossibility. On the bridge of the transport Gallant Hope, alarms shrieked in overlapping frequencies as turbolaser fire hammered against failing shields. Smoke filled the corridors. The deck plates vibrated with each impact. A young lieutenant clutched her console, her knuckles white, her voice breaking as she reported hull breaches on decks 4 and 5. The captain barked orders that no one could follow. Systems failed faster than they could be rerouted. In the chaos, no one noticed the shimmer of light near the aft cargo bay, a distortion that bent reality like heat rising from desert sand. Then it collapsed. Spock of Vulcan stood in the wreckage of a cargo container, his blue science uniform untouched by fire, his expression unreadable. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. The sparking conduits, the twisted metal, the acrid scent of burning insulation, the distant rumble of weapons fire. His internal chronometer indicated an anomaly. His tricorder, still clutched in his left hand, displayed readings that defied classification. He had been conducting a routine analysis of a subspace fissure near the neutral zone. Now he stood in what appeared to be a primitive spacecraft under active combat conditions, surrounded by technology that registered as both advanced and fundamentally incompatible with Federation standards. He raised one eyebrow. The cargo bay doors burst open. 3 rebel soldiers rushed in, blasters raised, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. They froze when they saw him. One of them, a Twi'lek with pale blue skin, lowered her weapon slightly, confusion replacing alarm. She spoke in a language Spock did not recognize, her tone urgent and questioning. He remained silent, his mind already analyzing phonetic patterns, searching for linguistic roots. The universal translator embedded in his tricorder began its work, cycling through probability matrices, constructing meaning from context and repetition. The ship lurched violently to starboard. Spock adjusted his stance with practiced ease, his center of gravity shifting to compensate. The soldiers staggered. One fell against a bulkhead, cursing. The Twi'lek barked an order and gestured toward the door. Spock understood the intent if not the words. They wanted him to move. He complied, following them into a corridor thick with smoke and chaos. Crew members ran past, carrying wounded or dragging equipment. A medical droid hovered near a junction, its manipulator arms working frantically on a burn victim. The screams echoed off the metal walls. Spock observed everything. The weapons carried by the soldiers, energy-based but utilizing a plasma containment system he had never encountered. The architecture, riveted panels, exposed conduits, a design philosophy that prioritized function over efficiency. The crew, humanoid, but diverse in ways that suggested either extensive genetic divergence or multiple species in close cooperation. He filed each detail into memory, constructing a framework of understanding even as the ship shuddered under another barrage. They reached the bridge. It was smaller than Spock had expected, crowded with personnel and equipment, lit by the harsh glow of tactical displays and warning indicators. The view screen showed the battle in terrible clarity. Star destroyers advancing in a pincer formation, their turbo laser batteries firing in coordinated volleys. TIE fighters swarmed like insects, their twin ion engines screaming as they strafed the fleeing transports. One exploded in a brilliant flash, its reactor breaching, and Spock registered the loss of approximately 200 lives in an instant. The captain turned. She was human, middle-aged, with grey streaking through her dark hair and lines of exhaustion carved deep around her eyes. She looked at Spock with the kind of weariness that comes from too many impossible decisions. The Twi'lek soldier spoke rapidly, gesturing. The captain's expression shifted from confusion to something harder to define. She studied Spock for 3.7 seconds, then issued a sharp command. The bridge crew hesitated. She repeated it, louder. One of the officers vacated his station. The captain pointed at it, then at Spock. The meaning was clear, even without translation. She wanted him to take the position. Spock moved to the console, his fingers hovering over controls that bore no resemblance to Starfleet interfaces. The universal translator provided fragments now, enough to understand basic commands. The station appeared to be environmental and power distribution. He scanned the readouts, assimilating their logic in seconds. The ship's reactor was operating at 114% of recommended capacity. Shield generators on the port side were failing. Life support was being routed through secondary backups. They were dying by degrees. Spock's fingers moved across the controls. He rerouted power from non-essential systems, stabilized the fluctuating plasma feeds, and rebalanced the shield harmonics to maximize coverage over critical areas. The ship's vibrations smoothed incrementally. An alarm ceased its wailing. The captain noticed. She said something that might have been a question or a command. Spock did not look up. He was already analyzing the broader tactical situation, his mind processing variables at a rate that would have seemed impossible to those around him. The Empire's formation was efficient but predictable. Their destroyers moved in concert, maintaining overlapping fields of fire while herding the rebel ships toward a predetermined kill zone. The TIE fighters operated in standard four-ship elements, their attack vectors following doctrine that prioritized volume of fire over precision. Spock recognized the pattern. A military force relying on overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical innovation. He input a series of calculations, factoring in thrust to mass ratios, probable response times, and weapon recharge cycles. A solution emerged. He turned to the captain and spoke in standard, his tone even. The universal translator converted his words into something she could understand, though the delay was minimal. He outlined a course correction that would take them through what appeared to be a gap in the Imperial formation, a window that would exist for exactly 42 seconds before closing. The captain stared at him. Her tactical officer objected, gesturing at the view screen. The proposed route took them within range of 2 Star Destroyers simultaneously. Spock acknowledged the risk and provided the probability of success, 67.3%. The captain's jaw tightened. She gave the order. The helmsman executed the maneuver with skill born of desperation. The gallant Hope banked hard, her sublights flaring as she accelerated directly toward the Imperial line. Turbo laser fire intensified, crimson bolts streaking past the viewports close enough to illuminate the bridge in hellish strobes. Spock's fingers danced across his console, feeding power to the shields in precise increments, reinforcing sections just before impacts occurred. The ship groaned. A conduit exploded on the port side, showering sparks across a crew station. A technician screamed. They plunged into the gap. For 3 seconds, they flew through the space between 2 Star Destroyers, so close that Spock could see the individual viewports on the Imperial vessels, the tiny silhouettes of personnel moving behind them. Then they were through, emerging on the far side of the formation with their shields at 18% and their reactor temperature climbing into dangerous ranges. But they were clear. The Imperial ships did not pursue immediately, their formation disrupted by the unexpected maneuver, their targeting solutions requiring recalculation. The captain laughed, a sound edged with hysteria and relief. She turned to Spock and spoke again. This time, the translator provided full comprehension. She asked who he was and where he had come from. Spock considered his response. He was not certain he could provide an answer that would make sense within the framework of this reality. He settled for the simplest truth. His name was Spock, he was a science officer, and he did not know how he had arrived aboard her vessel. The captain processed this information with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by the impossible. She introduced herself as Captain Maris Endara of the Rebel Alliance. The name Alliance suggested a coalition of resistance forces. The term rebel indicated conflict with an established authority. Spock filed both details alongside his growing catalogue of observations. He inquired about their destination. Endara gestured to the navigator, who brought up a star chart on the main display. Spock studied it with intense focus. The stellar cartography was entirely unfamiliar. None of the reference points matched Federation databases. The scale suggested a galaxy comparable in size to the Milky Way, but the distribution of systems and the notation system implied a civilization spanning thousands of inhabited worlds. He had not merely crossed space. The implications were profound. Spock set aside the question of how he had arrived for the more immediate concern of his present circumstances. He asked about the nature of the conflict. Endara's expression darkened. She explained with economy. The Galactic Empire ruled through fear and military might, crushing dissent wherever it arose. The Rebel Alliance fought to restore freedom and the Republic that had existed before. The battle they had just survived was one of hundreds occurring across the galaxy, a war of attrition that the rebellion was slowly losing. Spock asked about their numerical and material disadvantages. Endara provided estimates that confirmed his assessment. The Empire possessed overwhelming superiority in every measurable category: ships, troops, industrial capacity, financial resources. The rebellion survived through mobility, decentralization, and the support of sympathetic populations. Spock noted the inefficiency of such an approach. Decentralization prevented the concentration of force necessary for decisive victories. Mobility without strategic coordination resulted in piecemeal engagements that favored the enemy's superior numbers. He said as much. The bridge fell silent. Several officers turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Endara's eyes narrowed. She asked if he was suggesting they surrender. Spock clarified. He was suggesting their current strategic doctrine was statistically unlikely to result in victory. He was not advocating surrender, but rather a fundamental reassessment of their operational methodology. The silence deepened. Then Endara smiled, a thin and humorless expression. She said they could use someone who thought like that. The gallant Hope rendezvoused with the main fleet 6 hours later. They emerged from hyperspace near a moon whose surface was scarred with ancient impact craters, its orbit stable within a debris field that provided natural concealment. Rebel ships hung in the void, like refugees from a storm. Corvettes with scorched hulls, frigates trailing vapor from ruptured fuel lines, transports overcrowded with evacuees from Hoth. Spock stood in the observation bay, watching through the reinforced transparisteel as repair crews in vacuum suits swarmed over damaged vessels, their welding torches casting brief stars against the black. He found the scene statistically improbable. That such a fleet could survive even a single engagement with the Empire's military machine suggested either extraordinary luck or a variable he had not yet identified. Captain Endara had arranged for him to meet with Alliance Command. She believed his analytical capabilities could prove valuable. Spock neither agreed nor disagreed with her assessment. He simply followed the protocol officer through the crowded corridors of the command frigate Redemption's Light, noting the mixture of hope and exhaustion in the faces of those they passed. The briefing room was sparse: a holographic projector, a circular table, and 6 officers who represented the Alliance's surviving leadership. General Karvan Sorna sat at the table's head, a gray-haired man with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in uniform and carried the weight of every soldier lost. To his left was Admiral Lyanna Kor, younger than Spock had expected, her eyes sharp and calculating beneath a shock of red hair. The others held various ranks and specializations: intelligence, logistics, starfighter command. They studied Spock with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity as Captain Endara presented her report. When she finished, General Sorn leaned back in his chair. He asked Spock to explain his presence. Spock provided a concise summary: a spatial anomaly, a transition he could not adequately explain, and his current status as an involuntary participant in their conflict. He offered his services as an analyst, given that he lacked the means to return to his point of origin. Sorn exchanged glances with Kor. The Admiral asked about his qualifications. Spock listed them: extensive training in physics, mathematics, xenobiology, and tactical analysis, as well as practical experience in crisis management and first contact situations. The intelligence officer, a wiry Sullustan named Rhaegar, asked a more pointed question: could Spock be trusted? Spock considered the question's implicit accusation that he might be an Imperial agent or asset. He noted the logical consistency of such suspicion given his unexplained arrival. He offered no assurances beyond his demonstrated competence aboard the Gallant Hope. Actions, he suggested, would provide more reliable evidence than words. Rhaegar's jowls quivered in what might have been amusement or irritation. Sorn raised a hand, forestalling further debate. He made a decision. Spock would be assigned to Admiral Kor's Strategic Planning Division on a provisional basis. His movements would be monitored, his recommendations would be evaluated before implementation. If he proved valuable, his status would be reconsidered. If he proved a liability, he would be confined. Spock found the terms acceptable. Kor gestured for him to follow. They left the briefing room together, moving through corridors that thrummed with the background noise of a fleet preparing for the next crisis. Kor spoke as they walked. She explained the Alliance's immediate situation with a bluntness Spock appreciated. Hoth had been their primary base, a carefully concealed facility that had housed thousands of personnel and critical equipment. The Empire's discovery and assault had shattered their logistical network. Now they operated from scattered safe houses and mobile command ships, perpetually one step ahead of Imperial hunter-killer groups. Their fleet was damaged, their supplies dwindling, and morale eroding with each loss. She led him to the Strategic Planning Center, a chamber dominated by a massive holographic display showing the galaxy in miniature. Stars clustered in spiral arms, trade routes threaded between systems like glowing veins. Red markers indicated confirmed Imperial presence. Blue marked Alliance assets and sympathizer worlds. The red vastly outnumbered the blue. Kor gestured at the display with the kind of casual familiarity that came from staring at it for endless hours. She asked Spock for his assessment. He studied the map, his mind processing the spatial relationships, the distribution of forces, the logistical realities implied by distance and time. He identified 17 critical inefficiencies within 3 minutes. Kor listened without interruption as he outlined them. Redundant supply chains that wasted resources, forward bases positioned without regard for strategic depth, fleet elements dispersed so widely they could not support one another, intelligence gathering focused on tactical rather than strategic targets. Each inefficiency compounded the others, creating a system optimized for survival rather than victory. When he finished, Kor was silent for several seconds. Then she asked why he thought they hadn't corrected these problems themselves. Spock acknowledged the question's validity. He suggested 3 possibilities: insufficient computational resources to model complex logistics, institutional resistance to reorganization during active conflict, or emotional factors overriding rational decision-making. Kor's smile was grim. She said it was all 3, plus one more factor Spock hadn't mentioned. She brought up a new layer on the holographic display, this one showing patterns of Imperial patrol routes, response times to rebel activity, and predictive models of enemy behavior. The patterns were inconsistent. Spock observed anomalies. Imperial forces arriving at locations before rebel operations commenced. patrol routes shifting to intercept missions that had been planned in secret, response times that suggested foreknowledge rather than reaction. He stated the obvious conclusion: the Alliance had a security problem. Kor nodded. They suspected leaks, either through compromised personnel or sliced communications. Every strategic adjustment they made risked exposure. Every base they established risked discovery. They were playing a game where the opponent could see their moves before they made them. Spock asked about the Empire's intelligence apparatus. Kor provided details. The Imperial Security Bureau, an organization that combined signals intelligence, counterinsurgency operations, and psychological warfare. They were efficient, ruthless, and well-funded. The Alliance's counterintelligence capabilities were limited by comparison, reactive rather than proactive. Spock processed the information and made a recommendation: stop trying to hide. Kor stared at him. He elaborated: if the Empire could anticipate their covert movements, then covert movements cease to provide tactical advantage. Instead, the Alliance should create noise, generate false signals, and force the Empire to expend resources investigating phantom threats. Simultaneously, they should identify patterns in Imperial responses to determine the source and method of their intelligence leaks. Transparency could become a weapon if wielded correctly. The concept clearly unsettled Kor. She argued that transparency would expose them to even greater risk. Spock agreed, but noted that their current approach was producing measurably poor results. The definition of insanity, he observed, was repeating the same actions while expecting different outcomes. Kor's laugh was sharp and brief. She said he sounded like someone she used to know, a Jedi Knight who had believed in impossible solutions. Spock inquired about the Jedi. Kor's expression shifted, becoming distant. She explained, the Jedi had been guardians of peace and justice for thousands of years, warriors and diplomats who served the Republic and wielded the Force. The Force, she continued, was an energy field that connected all living things, a power that certain individuals could sense and manipulate. The Empire had exterminated the Jedi, hunting them to near extinction. Only a few remained, scattered and hidden. Spock found the concept of the Force scientifically implausible. He said so, carefully. Kor shrugged. She said she had seen things that defied explanation, objects moving without physical contact, premonitions of danger that saved lives, battles won against impossible odds through what could only be called fate. Spock noted that anecdotal evidence was insufficient to establish the existence of a universal energy field. Unexplained phenomena often had explanations that simply had not yet been discovered. Kor smiled again, this time with something that resembled pity. She said he would understand eventually. They worked through the night, Spock analyzing data, while Kor provided context and access to classified reports. He constructed models of Imperial strategic doctrine, identifying patterns in their deployment schedules, supply requisitions, and command decisions. The Empire operated with geometric precision, favoring overwhelming force and centralized control. Their tactics were effective but rigid. They struggled to adapt to unconventional threats. The rebellion's greatest asset was not their firepower but their unpredictability, an asset they were failing to exploit. Spock proposed a series of coordinated operations designed to stress-test Imperial response protocols. Small raids against targets of marginal value, timed to occur simultaneously across multiple sectors. The Empire would be forced to respond, revealing their prioritization algorithms and response capabilities. The data gathered could then inform a more sophisticated campaign. Kor reviewed his proposal with the careful attention of someone who had learned to distrust easy solutions. She asked about casualties. Spock provided statistical projections, a 12% probability of mission failure per operation, with an average of 3.4 fatalities per failed mission. Acceptable losses given the intelligence value gained. Kor's face hardened. She asked if he understood that those numbers represented real people, individuals with families and dreams and reasons to fight. Spock acknowledged the emotional weight of such decisions. He noted that sentiment, while understandable, could not be allowed to override strategic necessity. The silence between them stretched. Finally, Kor stood. She said she would present his proposal to General Sorn, but that Spock needed to understand something fundamental about the Alliance. They were not fighting a war of numbers. They were fighting a war of belief. Every soldier who joined them did so knowing they would probably die. They fought because they believed in something larger than themselves, a vision of a galaxy where freedom mattered more than order. If they lost that belief, they lost everything. Spock found the argument philosophically interesting but tactically irrelevant. He said so. Kor's response was quiet and sharp. She told him that if he wanted to help them win, he would need to understand that wars were not won by logic alone. Then she left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Spock remained in the planning center, surrounded by holographic stars and the ghosts of lost battles. He reviewed his calculations, searching for errors. He found none. His recommendations were sound. Yet something in Kor's words persisted in his thoughts. He accessed the Alliance's historical database, searching for context. He read accounts of the Clone Wars, the fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire. He studied propaganda and counter-propaganda, official records, and smuggled testimonies. A pattern emerged, one that defied simple categorization. The Alliance had survived not through superior strategy but through what could only be described as irrational persistence. They lost battles and kept fighting. They suffered defeats and found new reasons to hope. It was illogical. It was also undeniably effective in ways his models could not quantify. Spock cross-referenced military engagements with reported Force phenomena. Jedi generals had led clone armies with uncanny success. Sith lords had turned battles through abilities that violated known physics. He found references to precognition, telekinesis, energy projection, and mental influence. If even a fraction of these accounts were accurate, then the Force represented a variable that could not be dismissed. He required more data. The ship's library contained texts on Force philosophy, ancient and modern. Spock began reading, absorbing doctrine and debate. The Jedi spoke of the Force as a binding energy, a flow that connected all life and could be sensed by those with sufficient sensitivity. They divided it into the light side and the dark side, concepts laden with moral judgment. The light emphasized selflessness, compassion, and harmony. The dark embraced passion, strength, and individual will. Spock recognized the dichotomy as fundamentally flawed. Energy could not be inherently moral or immoral. It simply existed. The application determined the ethical dimension, not the Force itself. Yet the texts insisted otherwise. They spoke of corruption, of the dark side, as a seductive path that twisted those who walked it. They described the light as a state of being rather than a tool. The language was mystical, poetic, and frustratingly imprecise. He found himself intrigued despite his skepticism. The mathematical precision of his world had been replaced by one where intuition and destiny held measurable weight. His training insisted on empirical evidence. Yet the evidence surrounding him suggested phenomena that his training could not explain. He was a scientist in a galaxy where the impossible occurred with statistical regularity. The cognitive dissonance was profound. 3 days later, Spock accompanied a reconnaissance mission to the expansion region. Admiral Kor had approved a modified version of his proposal, scaling back the simultaneous raids to a single operation aimed at testing Imperial response times. The target was a listening post on a moon orbiting a gas giant, minimally defended and of modest strategic value. The mission team consisted of 8 rebels, pilots, soldiers, and a slicer tasked with extracting data from the post's mainframe. Spock was assigned as an observer, his role limited to analysis and documentation. The journey through hyperspace was Spock's first. He stood on the bridge of the corvette Silent Venture, watching through the viewport as stars stretched into lines and then collapsed into the swirling tunnel of hyperspace. The sensation was disorienting, a visual representation of faster-than-light travel that bore no resemblance to warp drive. The ship did not accelerate smoothly through normal space. It transitioned into an alternate dimension where the laws of physics bent in ways Spock found both fascinating and troubling. He inquired about the mechanics. The navigator, a young human named Jace, explained with the enthusiasm of someone who loved his work. Hyperspace was a dimension parallel to real space, accessible through hyperdrive technology that dated back millennia. Travel required precise calculations to avoid mass shadows, planets, stars, and other large objects that could rip a ship apart if intersected. Routes followed established hyperspace lanes mapped over generations. Deviation risked catastrophe. Spock noted the limitations. Hyperspace travel was faster than warp, but less flexible. A ship could not change course mid-jump. Pursuit required anticipating the destination. The Empire controlled most major hyperspace routes, using interdictor cruisers equipped with gravity well projectors to force rebel ships out of hyperspace into ambushes. Jace confirmed this, his enthusiasm dimming. They had lost too many ships to interdictors. They dropped out of hyperspace 12 hours later. The moon appeared on the view screen, a barren rock pocked with craters, its surface gray and lifeless beneath the pale light of the distant star. The listening post sat in a shallow depression, a cluster of sensor arrays and prefabricated structures protected by a single deflector shield. 2 TIE fighters circled in a lazy patrol pattern. Jace brought the silent Venture in low, skimming the surface to avoid detection. The assault team deployed in a dropship. Spock accompanied them, observing from the craft's rear compartment as they descended through the thin atmosphere. The team leader, a Zabrak woman named Kess, reviewed the plan with clipped efficiency. They would disable the shield generator, breach the command structure, extract the data, and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. Estimated mission duration, 18 minutes. Spock noted the precision of the timeline suggested extensive experience with similar operations. The dropship touched down half a kilometer from the post. The team moved out immediately, weapons ready, their movements coordinated through hand signals and helmet comms. Spock followed at a distance, his tricorder scanning environmental conditions and energy signatures. The moon's gravity was 0.68 standard, the atmosphere too thin for sustained human respiration. They advanced across the lunar surface in bounding strides, using craters for cover. The shield generator stood separate from the main complex, a squat, cylindrical structure humming with power. Kess assigned 2 soldiers to plant charges, while the rest of the team prepared to breach. Spock observed the process with clinical attention. The explosives were primitive by Federation standards, but effective. Shaped charges designed to direct the blast inward, minimizing collateral damage while maximizing structural failure. The soldiers worked quickly, their training evident in every movement. The explosion was precise. The shield flickered and died. Alarms shrieked across the post. The TIE fighters broke from their patrol, angling toward the intrusion. Kess barked orders. The team surged forward, blaster fire erupting as Imperial personnel emerged from the structures. Spock ducked behind a boulder, his ears assaulted by the crack and hiss of energy weapons. He watched the engagement with analytical detachment. The rebels fought with controlled aggression, advancing by fire and movement. The Imperials responded with doctrine-mandated defense, establishing a perimeter and calling for support. Neither side demonstrated tactical innovation. The outcome would be determined by execution and fortune rather than strategy. Spock timed the exchange, 4 minutes and 37 seconds before the Imperials were suppressed. The slicer, a Duros named Vixis, sprinted to the command center and began his work. Spock moved closer, observing. Vixis interfaced with the Imperial computer system using a datapad and a series of bypass protocols. The encryption was multi-layered, designed to resist intrusion. Vixis navigated it with practiced ease, his fingers dancing across controls. Spock asked questions about the architecture. Vixis answered absently, focused on his task. The system used a logic framework that Spock recognized as similar to certain older Federation designs. compartmentalized data storage with redundant authentication. The data extraction took 9 minutes. Vixis downloaded communication logs, patrol schedules, and sensor telemetry. As he worked, Spock noticed an anomaly in the logs, references to Force-sensitive individuals, reports flagged for inquisitorious review. He asked Vixis to isolate those files. The slicer complied, pulling records that detailed sightings, investigations, and terminations. The Empire was hunting Force users with systematic thoroughness. Kes called the withdrawal. They retreated to the dropship under covering fire, the Imperials regrouping behind makeshift barricades. The TIE fighters strafed their position, laser fire kicking up plumes of dust and shattered rock. One rebel took a hit, his armor cracking, his scream cut short. Another grabbed him and hauled him toward the ship. Spock assisted, supporting the wounded soldier's weight as they stumbled up the ramp. The dropship lifted off as turbo laser fire from an orbiting patrol ship began to rain down. They made it back to the silent Venture with 32 seconds to spare before the corvette jumped to hyperspace. In the medical bay, Spock helped stabilize the wounded soldier, while the team's medic worked with grim efficiency. The injury was severe. Third-degree burns across the torso, internal bleeding, possible organ damage. The medic administered Bacta injections and sedatives, his hands steady despite the ship's vibrations. The soldier's name was Ren. He was 19 standard years old. He had joined the Alliance after the Empire destroyed his homeworld for harboring rebel sympathizers. Spock learned these details from Kes as they stood outside the medical bay, waiting for word on Ren's condition. Kes spoke with the flat tone of someone who had delivered too many eulogies. She said Ren was a good kid, eager and brave, and probably too young to be fighting. Spock asked if she regretted bringing him on the mission. Kes looked at him as if he had asked whether she regretted breathing. She said regret was a luxury they could not afford. Every soldier knew the risks. Ren had volunteered. He had done his job. If he died, they would honor his sacrifice and keep fighting. That was all they could do. Spock found the response logically consistent, but emotionally troubling. He did not voice this observation. Ren survived. The medic's skill and the Bacta's regenerative properties stabilized him. He would need weeks of recovery and reconstructive surgery, but he would live. The news spread through the ship, lifting spirits. Spock noted the disproportionate relief. One soldier's survival seemed to outweigh the tactical success of the mission. He mentioned this to Admiral Kor when they reviewed the data. Kor's response was sharp. She said that one soldier's survival mattered more than tactical success because it reminded them why they fought. The Empire treated beings as expendable resources. The Alliance could not afford to think the same way and remain worth fighting for. Spock considered this argument. It contained an internal logic he could not dismiss. An organization that abandoned its ethical foundation in pursuit of victory risked becoming indistinguishable from its enemy. Yet the mathematics remained unchanged. They were losing. Slowly, incrementally, but losing. The data from the listening post confirmed Spock's earlier analysis. Imperial response times were improving. Their predictive models were becoming more accurate. Someone or something was feeding them intelligence. The Alliance's security was compromised at a fundamental level. Unless that breach was identified and sealed, no amount of tactical innovation would matter. Spock presented these findings to General Sornay. The general listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Spock finished, Sorn asked about recommendations. Spock outlined a three-phase approach. First, implement communication protocols that assumed total Imperial surveillance, eliminating the intelligence advantage. Second, establish a counterintelligence operation to identify the source of the breach. Third, restructure command and control to minimize the damage any single compromised element could inflict. Sorn approved phases 1 and 3 immediately. Phase 2, however, required resources and expertise the Alliance lacked. Counterintelligence was an art as much as a science, requiring intuition and psychological insight. Sawney said they had one person who might be able to help, but reaching her would be difficult. She operated in the deep core, a region of the galaxy so heavily controlled by the Empire that rebel operations there were nearly impossible. Spock asked about this individual. Her name was Zara Then, a former Imperial intelligence officer who had defected after witnessing atrocities she could not justify. She had been feeding the Alliance information for 2 years, using her knowledge of Imperial protocols to stay ahead of Hunter teams. If anyone could identify the Alliance's security breach, it was her. Sorn authorized a mission to extract her. Spock volunteered to accompany it. Kor objected. She argued that Spock's value lay in analysis, not field operations. Sending him into the deep core risked losing an asset they could not replace. Spock countered that his presence would increase the mission's probability of success. His analytical capabilities could assist with infiltration planning. His unfamiliarity with Imperial culture would make him less susceptible to behavioral profiling. And, he added, he required direct observation to refine his understanding of this galaxy's unique variables. Sorn approved the request. The mission launched 3 days later. The team consisted of 6 operatives, all veterans of deep penetration work. Kes led them, still bearing the weight of Wren's injury. The slicer Vixis came along to handle technical challenges. A pilot named Tarek flew their ship, a battered freighter modified for smuggling and speed. 2 soldiers, Joran and Miss, provided security, and Spock, the outsider, served as their strategist. They traveled through hyperspace for 37 hours, following a route that threaded through uncharted systems and avoided Imperial checkpoints. The deep core's stellar density made navigation treacherous. Tarek piloted with a combination of skill and what he called instinct, making micro-corrections to their course that prevented catastrophic collisions with rogue planetoids. Spock noted the precision required and asked if Tarek possessed any unusual sensory capabilities. The pilot laughed and said he just had a feel for it, nothing mystical. Spock was not convinced. They emerged near Pesktan, a factory world that churned out munitions and armor plating for the Imperial war machine. The planet's surface glowed with the heat of endless forges. Orbital stations hung in chains, their docking bays crowded with bulk freighters. Star destroyers patrolled in overlapping spheres, their presence a reminder that this was the Empire's heartland. No rebellion here, only production and obedience. Zara then operated from a safe house in the planet's industrial sector. Reaching her required bypassing security checkpoints designed to catch smugglers and insurgents. Tarek landed the freighter at a public spaceport, filing a manifest that claimed they were hauling spare parts for mining equipment. Inspectors scanned the cargo with perfunctory attention, their minds already on their next shift. The team disembarked in small groups, blending into the crowds that thronged Peshtan's grimy streets. Spock walked beside Kes through corridors choked with smoke and noise. Factories belched exhaust into the sky. Workers moved in rivers, their faces blank with exhaustion. Stormtroopers patrolled in squads, their white armor spotless despite the filth around them. Propaganda holoscreens displayed images of Emperor Palpatine, his withered face smiling benevolently as text scrolled promises of order and prosperity. Spock observed everything, filing details into memory. The safe house was a tenement wedged between 2 munitions plants. Kes led them through a service entrance and up 3 flights of stairs that groaned under their weight. She knocked on a door in a pattern, 3 slow, 2 fast, 1 slow. The door opened a crack. A woman's voice demanded a passphrase. Kes provided it. The door swung wide. Zara then was small and sharp-featured, her eyes holding the kind of wariness that came from years of looking over her shoulder. She looked at the team and swore softly. She said she had expected a single courier, not an entire squad. Kes apologized, but said the situation had escalated. They needed her expertise, and they needed it now. Then gestured them inside, locking the door behind them. The safe house was cramped. A single room with a cot, a desk covered in datapads, and a small kitchenette. then poured herself a drink from a bottle that looked like it had seen better days. She asked what they wanted. Kes outlined the problem: the Alliance's compromised security, the pattern of Imperial foreknowledge, the need to identify the breach. Then listened, her expression darkening. When Kes finished, then drained her glass and poured another. She said they were dealing with something more sophisticated than a simple leak. The Empire had multiple methods for gathering intelligence: sliced communications, turned agents, interrogation of captured personnel, and predictive algorithms fed by vast data networks. But there was one more possibility. Then spoke carefully, as if the words themselves were dangerous. She said the Emperor commanded servants called Inquisitors, former Jedi twisted to serve the dark side. They hunted Force sensitives, but they also performed other tasks: breaking minds, extracting secrets, sensing deception. If an Inquisitor was involved, traditional counterintelligence would fail. You could not hide thoughts from someone who could read them. Spock asked if such abilities were verifiable, then laughed, a bitter sound. She said she had seen an Inquisitor tear information from a prisoner's mind without asking a single question. She had watched a woman scream until her voice broke, her memories flayed open like a dissected corpse. The Inquisitor had walked away afterward as if nothing significant had occurred, then had resigned from Imperial intelligence the next day. Verification, she said, was not the issue. Survival was. Spock assimilated this information. If Then's account was accurate, then the Force represented a security vulnerability that conventional protocols could not address. Mental shielding techniques existed in Vulcan culture, disciplines that protected the mind from telepathic intrusion. He asked if similar methods existed here, then said the Jedi had trained in mental defenses, but those techniques were lost or hidden. The few rebels with Force sensitivity lacked formal training. Kes asked if Then could identify which rebel cells had been compromised. Then pulled up a datapad and began scrolling through files. She cross-referenced Imperial raid patterns with rebel operations, looking for correlations. After several minutes, she highlighted 3 cells, one in the outer rim, one in the mid-rim, and one in Alliance High Command itself. The pattern was clear. Every time these cells received sensitive information, the Empire responded within days. The room grew cold. Kes asked if Then was suggesting a mole at the command level. Then said she was not suggesting it, she was confirming it. Someone with access to strategic planning was feeding the Empire everything. The question was who and how. Spock reviewed the data, his mind racing through possibilities. He asked for personnel records. Everyone who had access to compromised information before Imperial responses occurred, then provided the files. Spock analyzed them, searching for patterns: travel records, communication logs, behavioral anomalies. 3 names emerged as possibilities, all senior officers with long service records and impeccable credentials. Isolating the mole would require direct investigation, something that would alert the individual if handled incorrectly. Spock proposed a trap: feed each suspect different false information and observe which false intelligence the Empire acted upon. Then approved the methodology. Kes agreed reluctantly. They would need approval from General Sorn to implement it, which meant transmitting the plan through potentially compromised channels. Spock suggested a solution: compartmentalize the operation. Only Sorn and the investigative team would know the full scope. Each suspect would receive their false intelligence through isolated channels that mimicked routine briefings. The mole would betray themselves through the Empire's response. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They spent the next 4 hours refining details, then providing insights into Imperial intelligence protocols, while Spock modeled probable responses. Vixie set up encrypted communication channels using a cipher that then guaranteed the Empire had not yet broken. By the time they finished, the safehouse's small window showed the first light of Peskan's artificial dawn, the sky glowing orange from factory emissions. Then agreed to return with them. She said she was tired of running, tired of hiding, If the Alliance had a chance to root out the mole, she wanted to be part of it. Kes warned her that extraction would be dangerous, then smiled grimly. She said living under the Empire was dangerous. At least this way, she could fight back. They left the safe house in the same scattered groups they had arrived in. Spock walked with Joran, the younger of the two soldiers, a human male whose quiet demeanor concealed a sharp tactical mind. They moved through Peschthan's morning crowds, just two more workers in a sea of exhausted faces. Joran asked Spock if he believed they would find the mole. Spock said the probability was high, assuming the trap functioned as designed. Joran asked what would happen to the mole once identified. Spock noted the question's implications. Summary execution was not uncommon in wartime. The mole had caused the deaths of hundreds, possibly thousands. Justice might demand a swift resolution. Joran said he hoped they would get a trial, a chance to explain or confess. Spock asked if that was sentiment or strategy. Joran said it was both. He wanted to understand why someone would betray everything the Alliance fought for. What could the Empire offer that was worth the blood on your hands? Spock had no answer. They reached the spaceport without incident. The freighter waited where they had left it, unremarkable among dozens of similar vessels. Tarek had already completed pre-flight checks. The team boarded quickly, then pulling her hood low to conceal her face. Inspectors waved them through with barely a glance. Peschthan's bureaucracy prioritized throughput over security, a flaw the Empire tolerated because it kept production flowing. The freighter lifted off smoothly. They cleared the atmosphere and accelerated toward the hyperspace jump point. Star destroyers tracked their departure with passive sensors, their interest minimal. Just another cargo hauler leaving just another factory world. Tarek engaged the hyperdrive. Stars stretched into lines. The galaxy fell away. Spock stood on the bridge, watching the swirling tunnel of hyperspace. He reflected on what then had said about the Inquisitors, about minds torn open and secrets extracted. If such abilities existed, they represented a form of violation more profound than physical torture. The sanctity of thought was foundational to sentient rights. An enemy who could breach that sanctity possessed a weapon that conventional warfare could not counter. Vulcan mental disciplines might provide protection, but teaching them required time and cultural context that the Alliance lacked. He considered alternatives. Technology could sometimes achieve what biology could not. If the Force operated as an energy field interacting with neural tissue, then it might be possible to disrupt that interaction through precisely calibrated EM fields or neural damping frequencies. The theory was speculative, but Spock had worked with less. He made a note to investigate further once they returned to the fleet. The journey back took 41 hours. They emerged near the rendezvous coordinates to find the fleet had relocated again, standard protocol after any extended operation. Tarek followed the beacon to a new hiding place. The debris field of a dead star system, the remnants of shattered worlds providing cover and interference. The Redemption's light hung among the wreckage like a ghost. General Sorn met them personally in the hangar. He greeted them with respect and relief, thanking her for her service and her courage, then brushed off the gratitude, saying she was just doing what needed to be done. Sorn led them to a secure conference room where Admiral Kor waited. Spock presented the plan to identify the mole, outlining the methodology and expected timelines. Sorn listened with the focused attention of a man who understood the stakes. He authorized the operation immediately. The trap was set over the next 72 hours. Each of the three suspects received different intelligence during routine briefings. The first was told of a planned raid on an Imperial supply depot in the Arcanis sector. The second received information about a rebel diplomatic mission to a neutral system. The third learned of a convoy route change for a critical shipment of medical supplies. All three pieces of intelligence were false. Now they waited. Spock spent the waiting period analyzing Force-related data. He reviewed combat reports, witness testimonies, and holocron fragments recovered from Jedi ruins. The accounts painted a picture of abilities that violated conservation of energy, causality, and information theory. Precognition suggested access to future information states. Telekinesis implied force generation without reaction mass. Mind influence indicated quantum entanglement across biological systems. None of it made sense within his understanding of physics. Yet it happened. Repeatedly, consistently, measurably. Spock was forced to conclude that either his understanding was incomplete or the laws governing this galaxy differed fundamentally from those of his native universe. Both possibilities were profoundly unsettling. He had built his identity on the foundation of logic and empirical truth. This galaxy challenged that foundation at every turn. On the fourth day, the Empire responded. An Imperial battle group moved toward the Arcanis sector, positioning itself to intercept the raid that would never occur. Intelligence confirmed the deployment through multiple sources. The trap had worked. The first suspect, a logistics officer named Commander Verick, had transmitted the false intelligence. Sorn ordered his immediate arrest. Verick was brought to the brig without incident. Spock observed through a security feed as ISB protocol droids searched Verick's quarters. They found an encrypted transmitter hidden inside a deactivated astromech unit, sophisticated enough to punch through Alliance jamming. Slicer teams decrypted the device's memory, recovering months of transmissions. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Verick had been feeding the Empire strategic intelligence for nearly a year. General Sorn called an emergency tribunal. Alliance military law allowed for expedited trials during active combat operations. Verick was brought before a panel of 3 officers, Sorne, Kor, and a Quarren named Captain Resh. Spock attended as an observer, curious about the proceedings. Verick stood in restraints, his face pale but defiant. The evidence was presented methodically. The transmissions, the correlations, the undeniable pattern of betrayal. Verick did not deny it. When given the opportunity to speak, he said he had done what he believed was necessary. The Empire was the galaxy's legitimate government, established through legal process and maintained through strength. The rebellion was a terrorist movement prolonging a war that was already lost. He had tried to minimize casualties by helping the Empire end the conflict quickly. He believed he had acted honorably. The tribunal disagreed. Sorn pronounced judgment, guilty of treason, espionage, and collaboration with the enemy. The sentence was death by firing squad, to be carried out immediately. Verick accepted the verdict without visible emotion. He asked only that his personal effects be sent to his family. Kor nodded. Guards escorted Verick from the chamber. Spock found the entire proceeding troubling. Not because he disagreed with the verdict, the evidence was conclusive, but because of the speed. 73 minutes from arrest to execution. No appeals process. No opportunity for deeper investigation into Verick's motivations or possible coercion. The efficiency was militarily sound but philosophically questionable. He mentioned this to Then later as they reviewed the decrypted transmissions in the intelligence center. Then's response was pragmatic. She said war demanded ugly choices. They could not afford the luxury of lengthy trials when every day Verick remained alive was a day he might find a way to send one more message. The Empire had converted prisoners before, broken their conditioning, and sent them back as sleeper agents. Quick justice was harsh justice, but it was also certain justice. Spock noted the logical consistency. He also noted the moral cost. The Alliance was adapting to its enemy's methods, becoming harder and colder. Then saw his expression and sighed. She said that was the nature of total war. You either changed to survive, or you died pristine and useless. The trick was not losing yourself entirely in the process. Spock asked how one maintained that balance. Then said she was still figuring it out. With Verick's arrest, the immediate security breach was sealed. But the damage he had caused could not be undone. The Alliance restructured its communication protocols, implementing the compartmentalization Spock had recommended. Intelligence was distributed on a need-to-know basis. Strategic planning occurred in isolated cells that could not compromise one another. The changes were necessary but created new inefficiencies. Admiral Kor assigned Spock to optimize the new structure. He worked 18-hour days, modeling information flows and identifying bottlenecks. Then assisted, her knowledge of Imperial countermeasures invaluable. Together, they created a system that balanced security against operational tempo. It was not perfect. Nothing in war was perfect. But it was measurably better than what had existed before. During this period, Spock had his first direct encounter with the Force. It occurred during a briefing aboard the Redemption's Light. Admiral Kor was presenting an analysis of recent Imperial fleet movements when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes unfocused, her hand rising to her temple. The room fell silent. Then Kor spoke a single word: danger. Alarms began shrieking 2 seconds later. An Imperial interdictor had emerged from hyperspace, its gravity well projectors activating, trapping the rebel fleet. The attack that followed was brutal and precise. TIE fighters poured from the interdictor's hangar, supported by 2 star destroyers that dropped out of hyperspace in perfect flanking positions. The rebels scrambled to respond, their ships breaking from formation as turbo-laser fire lanced through the void. Spock made his way to the bridge, observing as the battle unfolded across tactical displays. Admiral Kor commanded with swift decisiveness, ordering a fighting retreat toward the debris field. But she moved as if she knew where the enemy would be before they arrived. She ordered evasive maneuvers seconds before turbo-laser barrages fired. She redirected fighters to intercept TIE elements that had not yet appeared on sensors. Her commands defied the information available to her, yet they were consistently correct. Spock watched with fascination. This was either extraordinary intuition or something else entirely. The fleet fought free over the course of 37 minutes. They lost 2 ships and suffered damage to half a dozen more, but they escaped. As the last vessels jumped to hyperspace, Spock approached Kor. She looked exhausted, sweat beading on her forehead. He asked how she had known to order the evacuation before sensors detected the interdictor. Kor met his eyes and said she had felt it, a disturbance in the Force, like a shadow falling across her thoughts. Spock asked if she was Force-sensitive. Kor shook her head. She said she had no ability to move objects or influence minds, but sometimes, in moments of crisis, she sensed things, directions to take, dangers to avoid. It was not reliable, not something she could summon at will, but it was there. She called it instinct. Spock noted that instinct was pattern recognition, operating below conscious awareness. What she described seemed qualitatively different. Kor smiled. She said he was starting to understand. The Force was not something you reasoned your way to. You felt it, trusted it, let it guide you. Spock found the concept philosophically challenging. Trusting feelings over analysis ran counter to everything he had been trained to value. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Kor's seemingly irrational decisions had saved the fleet. He needed to investigate further. The Alliance had few Force-sensitive individuals, and those they had were untrained or minimally trained. But there were texts, records recovered from Jedi temples destroyed during the purges. Spock requested access. General Sorn approved, curious about what a scientist would make of mystical philosophy. The texts were stored in the Redemption's Light's vault, encrypted and carefully guarded. Spock spent days reading. The Jedi writings spoke of the Force as a living entity, a cosmic current that flowed through all things. They described meditation techniques, exercises to quiet the mind and open oneself to the Force's presence. They warned of the dangers. Attachment led to fear, fear to anger, anger to suffering. The dark side waited for those who sought power for its own sake. Spock found the moral absolutism problematic. Emotions were not inherently destructive. They were biological responses to stimuli, necessary for survival and social cohesion. The Jedi's insistence on emotional suppression seemed as extreme as the Sith's embrace of passion without restraint. A more balanced approach would acknowledge emotions while maintaining rational control, much like Vulcan philosophy. Yet the Jedi had maintained peace for millennia. Their methods, however flawed, had produced measurable results. Spock could not dismiss that. He decided to attempt one of the meditation exercises described in the texts. It required a quiet space and focused concentration. He found a small observation deck, empty during the night cycle, and sat in the traditional posture described, spine straight, hands resting on knees, eyes closed. He began with Vulcan mental disciplines. Breathing slowed, heart rate decreased, conscious thought quieted. Then he attempted to extend his awareness outward, as the Jedi texts described, searching for the presence of the Force. Minutes passed. He felt nothing beyond the normal sensory input, the hum of the ship's engines, the slight vibration of deck plates, the temperature differential near the viewports. He persisted. The texts emphasized patience, the need to release expectation and simply be open. Spock found this instruction paradoxical. How could one pursue a goal while releasing the desire to achieve it? Yet he continued the exercise, allowing his mind to settle into deeper stillness. Somewhere in that stillness, something shifted. It was not a thought or a sensation in any conventional sense. It was presence. Vast and subtle, like the space between heartbeats or the silence beneath sound. Spock's eyes opened involuntarily. The observation deck appeared unchanged, but he felt as though a veil had lifted. The stars beyond the viewport seemed closer, more immediate. The ship around him hummed with a vitality he had not perceived before. And somewhere, distant but distinct, he sensed other minds. Core on the bridge, then in the intelligence center, hundreds of crew members going about their duties. The sensation faded as quickly as it had come. Spock sat motionless, his logical mind struggling to categorize what he had experienced. It had not been telepathy in the Vulcan sense, which operated through physical proximity and mental touch. This had been something broader, a field of awareness that transcended individual consciousness. If the Force existed, he had just glimpsed its edge. He required more data. Over the following weeks, Spock continued his meditation practice while maintaining his analytical work. He began to notice correlations, moments when his intuition suggested courses of action before his conscious analysis reached the same conclusions. Small things at first. A sense that he should review a particular data set, which then revealed critical patterns. An urge to avoid a specific corridor, which later suffered a conduit rupture. Incidents that could be explained as coincidence, until they could not. During a planning session, Spock experienced what could only be described as a vision. He was reviewing potential staging areas for a supply operation when his awareness suddenly shifted. He saw, with absolute clarity, an Imperial ambush. Star destroyers dropping from hyperspace, TIE bombers saturating the area with proton torpedoes, rebel ships dying in fire and vacuum. The vision lasted perhaps 3 seconds. When it ended, he was staring at the holographic display while Admiral Core asked if he was well. Spock recommended they change the staging area. Core asked why. Spock hesitated. He could not cite a vision as evidence. It would undermine his credibility as a logical analyst. Yet he could not ignore what he had seen. He improvised, noting that the original location's proximity to known Imperial patrol routes created unnecessary risk. An alternative location offered better concealment with minimal additional travel time. Core accepted the logic and adjusted the plan. 3 days later, intelligence reported an Imperial fleet amassing near the original staging area. Core looked at Spock across the planning table. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They both understood what had occurred. Spock had predicted Imperial movements through means that had nothing to do with analysis. He had sensed the danger through the Force. The realization was profoundly unsettling. His identity rested on the foundation of logic. The Force represented a departure from that foundation. Yet he could not deny its utility. If he possessed even limited Force sensitivity, it could be cultivated and refined. The Jedi texts described training methods, though they assumed the presence of a master to guide the student. Spock had no master. He would need to proceed empirically, testing hypotheses and observing results. the scientific method applied to mysticism. The irony was not lost on him. Admiral Kaur approached him privately after the briefing. She asked directly if he had experienced a Force vision. Spock considered dissembling but decided honesty served better. He confirmed that he had perceived something he could not explain through conventional means. Kaur nodded slowly. She said the Alliance had protocols for individuals who demonstrated Force sensitivity. They were kept secret from most personnel to protect them from Imperial Inquisitors. Would Spock be willing to meet with someone who could help him understand his abilities? Spock agreed. 2 days later, he was introduced to Jen Mora. She was a Mirialan woman in her 50s, her green skin marked with traditional tattoos, her eyes holding depths of sorrow and wisdom. She had been a Jedi consular before the Purges, specializing in diplomacy and healing rather than combat. She had survived by hiding her abilities and her identity, living as a simple medic aboard rebel ships. Kaur had brought her into confidence after Spock's vision. They met in a meditation chamber, a small room insulated against sound and external distractions. Mora studied Spock with an intensity that seemed to look past his physical form. She asked him to describe his experiences. Spock provided a detailed account: the initial meditation, the moments of heightened intuition, the vision of the Imperial ambush. Mora listened without interruption. When he finished, she was silent for several moments. Then she said he was unusual. Most Force sensitives perceive the Force through emotion, joy, fear, love, anger. These emotions acted as conduits, amplifying their connection to the living Force. Spock's perception seemed different, filtered through logic and analysis rather than feeling. It was not unprecedented. She had known Jedi who approached the Force intellectually, but it was rare. The Force touched every being differently, reflecting their nature back to them. Spock found this philosophically intriguing. If the Force adapted to individual consciousness, it suggested a level of sentience, or at least responsiveness. Mora smiled at his phrasing. She said the Force was not sentient in any conventional sense, but it was alive. It flowed through living things, connecting them in a vast web of existence. To touch the Force was to touch all life, to feel the joy and pain of the galaxy as if it were your own. Spock asked if such empathy was not overwhelming. Mora said it could be, especially for those untrained. The Jedi taught techniques to maintain boundaries, to experience the Force without being consumed by it. She could teach him those techniques if he wished to learn. Spock stated that he had no desire to become a warrior. Mora said the Force was not only for warriors. It could be used to heal, to understand, to bring peace. What mattered was the intention behind its use. They began training that day. Mora taught him to meditate more deeply, to extend his awareness through the Force with deliberate focus rather than accidental glimpses. She showed him how to sense the emotions of others, a skill she called empathy through the Force. Spock found this challenging. Vulcans practiced emotional control to avoid the turbulence of feeling. Opening himself to others' emotions felt like deliberate self-sabotage. Yet he persisted. The training occurred in short sessions between his other duties. Spock continued his strategic work with Admiral Kaur while spending an hour each day with Mora. Progress was incremental but measurable. He learned to distinguish his own thoughts from impressions received through the Force. He developed the ability to sense danger before it manifested, a skill that proved valuable during combat operations. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to change. The rigid boundaries he maintained between logic and emotion started to blur. He found himself experiencing compassion for the rebels he worked alongside, not as an abstract appreciation for their cause, but as genuine concern for their well-being. When Ren, the young soldier injured on the listening post mission, returned to duty, Spock felt relief rather than simply noting his recovery as a positive operational outcome. It was disorienting. Mora said it was growth. She told him that the Force did not diminish logic. It expanded it. True wisdom required both reason and compassion, intellect and intuition. The Jedi who had been lost in rigid dogma and the Sith had been consumed by unchecked passion. Balance meant walking between those extremes. Spock found the concept appealing, even as he struggled to embody it. During this period, the Alliance launched its most ambitious operation yet. Intelligence indicated that the Empire was constructing a new superweapon, something that made their previous Death Star seem primitive by comparison. The project was based at a hidden facility in the unknown regions, protected by layers of secrecy and military might. General Sorn decided the facility had to be destroyed before the weapon became operational. Every available asset would be committed to the mission. Spock participated in the planning from the beginning. The facility's location had been extracted from captured Imperial data cores at tremendous cost. 3 Rebel intelligence operatives had died securing the information. The coordinates led to a system with no name, just a numerical designation orbiting a dying red giant. The facility itself was built into an asteroid, shielded and heavily fortified. Direct assault would be suicide. Spock proposed an alternative approach. Rather than attacking the facility directly, they could sabotage the supply chain that supported it. The weapon required rare materials and specialized components. Interrupt the supply flow, and construction would halt. The Empire would be forced to either abandon the project or reveal it by requesting emergency shipments through trackable channels. Admiral Kor supported the plan. General Sorn was skeptical but authorized reconnaissance. The reconnaissance team included Spock. He volunteered, arguing that his force sensitivity would provide early warning of threats. Mora objected privately, saying he was not ready for a combat mission. Spock noted that readiness was a subjective assessment. He had skills that could increase the mission's probability of success. That was sufficient justification. Mora relented, but she insisted on accompanying him. If he was going into danger, he would have a Jedi at his side. The mission launched with a fleet of 12 ships. Their target was a convoy transporting processed kyber crystals, the power source for the superweapon. The convoy would pass through the Gordian Trace, a hyperspace lane notorious for gravitational anomalies. It was one of the few routes into the unknown regions, which made it predictable. The rebels would intercept there. They waited in the trace for 18 hours. Ships drifted in the distorted space between stars, their crews tense and silent. Spock meditated in the hold of the assault frigate Defiant Strike, Mora sitting across from him. She guided him through centering exercises, helping him attune to the Force's flow. He felt the presence of the other rebels, their fear and determination mingling into a complex tapestry of emotion. Then he felt something else. Darkness. Cold and vast, like the void between galaxies. It approached from the direction they were watching, a presence that made the Force itself recoil. Spock's eyes snapped open. He said a single word, Inquisitor. Mora went pale. She reached for the comm, alerting Admiral Kor. The fleet went to battle stations. The convoy emerged from hyperspace precisely on schedule. 6 bulk freighters escorted by a Star Destroyer and 2 squadrons of TIE fighters. Standard Imperial procedure, but riding alongside them was a smaller ship, sleek and predatory, its hull black as obsidian. Spock felt the darkness radiating from it like heat from a furnace. Mora confirmed his assessment, an Inquisitor's vessel. The battle plan required immediate adjustment. Admiral Kor made the call. They would engage as planned but prioritize speed over throughput. Get in, destroy the freighters, and withdraw before the Inquisitor could respond. The fleet surged forward. Turbo-laser batteries opened fire. The Star Destroyer's shields flared under the onslaught. TIE fighters scrambled to intercept. Spock remained in the hold, his awareness extended through the Force. He sensed the Inquisitor's attention turn toward the Rebel fleet, a predatory focus that made his skin crawl. Then he felt the Inquisitor's power reach out, tendrils of dark side energy probing the attacking ships, searching for Force sensitives. Mora gasped beside him. The Inquisitor had sensed them. The black ship accelerated toward the Defiant Strike. Admiral Kor ordered the frigate to withdraw, but the Inquisitor's ship was faster. It closed the distance with unnatural speed, weapons firing. The frigate's shields buckled. An explosion rocked the hold. Mora grabbed Spock's arm, pulling him toward the escape pods. But Spock hesitated. If they fled, the Inquisitor would pursue. The only way to protect the fleet was to confront the threat. He told Mora this. She stared at him as if he had lost his mind. He was barely trained, no match for an Inquisitor in combat. Spock agreed but noted that combat was not the only option. Distraction could be equally effective. If he could occupy the Inquisitor's attention, the fleet could complete its mission and escape. Mora said that was suicide. Spock said it was probability management. The ship shuddered under another impact. Mora made a decision. She agreed to the plan but insisted they face the Inquisitor together. Spock began to object, but she cut him off. A Jedi did not abandon those who fought beside them. If they were going to die, they would die with purpose. Spock found the sentiment illogical but also deeply moving. He inclined his head in acceptance. They made their way to the hangar bay. The Inquisitor's ship had latched onto the frigate's hull, its boarding clamps grinding through armor plating. Stormtroopers would pour through soon. Mora ignited her lightsaber, a blade of pure green light that hummed with restrained power. Spock had no weapon beyond a blaster he barely knew how to use. He reached out through the Force instead, sensing the Inquisitor's approach. The airlock exploded inward. Stormtroopers advanced through the breach, their blasters firing in disciplined volleys. Mora deflected the bolts with her lightsaber, the blade moving in arcs too fast for the eye to follow. Spock ducked behind a cargo container, his mind racing through tactical options. The stormtroopers were efficient but predictable. He identified their firing patterns, the gaps in their formation. He called out positions to Mora, and she adjusted her defense accordingly. Then the Inquisitor entered. He was tall and angular, his face hidden behind a mask that resembled a predator's skull. His lightsaber was unlike anything Spock had seen, a double-bladed weapon that spun like a saw, its red blades casting crimson light across the hangar. He moved with fluid grace, each step deliberate and controlled. His presence in the Force was overwhelming, a black star that warped everything around it. Mora stepped forward to meet him. The duel that followed was beyond Spock's ability to fully comprehend. Lightsabers clashed in a blur of green and red, the impact sending sparks cascading across the deck. Mora fought with precision and economy, her movements rooted in Form 3, Saresu, the defensive style. The Inquisitor attacked with relentless aggression, his spinning blade creating a wall of death. Spock watched, searching for an opening. His tactical mind analyzed the fight in real time. The Inquisitor was faster and stronger, but Mora had greater experience. She anticipated his attacks, redirected his momentum, preserved her energy. Yet she was aging, her reflexes not what they had been in her youth. The Inquisitor sensed this weakness and pressed harder. Spock reached out through the Force. He did not know what he was attempting, only that he needed to help. He felt the Inquisitor's mind, a fortress of malice and ambition. Spock did not try to penetrate it. Instead, he touched the edges, creating a moment of distraction. It was subtle, barely a flicker. But in a duel measured in milliseconds, subtlety mattered. Mora's blade found an opening. She struck at the Inquisitor's leg, her lightsaber cutting through armor and into flesh. The Inquisitor snarled and staggered. Mora pressed the advantage, driving him back. For a moment, Spock allowed himself to hope they might prevail. Then the Inquisitor unleashed the dark side. Force lightning erupted from his hands. Mora raised her lightsaber to absorb it, but the sheer power overwhelmed her defenses. She screamed as electricity coursed through her body. Her lightsaber fell from nerveless fingers. She collapsed to the deck, smoke rising from her robes. Spock felt her pain through the Force, a searing agony that threatened to shatter his control. Logic failed. Something else rose in its place. Rage. Pure, incandescent, utterly irrational. Spock surged to his feet, his hand extending toward the Inquisitor. He did not think. He did not calculate. He simply reached into the Force and pushed. The Inquisitor flew backward. He crashed into the bulkhead with enough force to dent the metal, his body crumpling. Spock advanced, his rage a living thing, the dark side responding to his fury with seductive power. He could feel it whispering, "Take what you need, destroy what threatens you, let go of restraint and embrace strength." It would be so easy. Mora's voice cut through the darkness. She whispered his name, her voice weak but insistent. Spock stopped. He looked down at her, saw the pain in her eyes, the blood staining her robes, and he understood. If he surrendered to rage, if he embraced the dark side, then Mora's sacrifice would be meaningless. He would become the very thing they fought against. He released the anger. It drained from him like water from a broken vessel, leaving him hollow and exhausted. The Inquisitor climbed to his feet, his mask cracked, but his fury intact. He raised his hand to unleash another attack. But before he could, the frigate's hull breached. Explosive decompression tore through the hangar. Stormtroopers were sucked into the void. The Inquisitor grabbed onto a support strut, his strength keeping him anchored. Spock grabbed Mora and activated the emergency bulkhead. It slammed down between them and the Inquisitor, sealing the breach. Atmosphere rushed back into the secured section. Spock lowered Mora gently, checking her vitals. She was alive, but barely. Her injuries were severe. Electrical burns across her torso, possible internal damage. He called for a medical team, his voice hoarse. The battle outside had concluded. The rebel fleet had destroyed the convoy and withdrawn, their mission accomplished. The Defiant strike limped away from the engagement, its hull scarred but intact. Admiral Kor sent a recovery team for Spock and Mora. They were extracted and brought to the medical frigate, where Bacta tanks and surgical droids waited. Mora survived the surgery. The medical staff gave her a 73% chance of full recovery. Spock sat beside her tank in the recovery ward, watching the Bacta work its slow magic. He meditated, not on the Force but on what had occurred. He had touched the dark side, he had felt its power and its seduction, and he had chosen to step back. That choice defined him more than any logical argument ever had. General Sorn visited 3 days later. He commended Spock for his actions, noting that the destruction of the convoy had set the Empire's superweapon project back by months, possibly years. It was a significant victory. Spock accepted the recognition but felt no satisfaction. Victory measured in suffering seemed hollow. Sorny seemed to understand. He said that war asked terrible things of good people. The burden of command was knowing that every success came at a price, paid in blood and trauma. The only way to honor that price was to ensure the cause was worth it. Spock asked if Sorn believed the cause was worth it. The general's answer was immediate. Yes. A galaxy under the Empire's boot was no galaxy at all. Better to die fighting than live in chains. Spock considered this philosophy. It prioritized freedom over survival, principle over pragmatism. From a purely logical standpoint, it was inefficient. From a moral standpoint, it was defensible. The tension between those perspectives had defined his entire time with the rebellion. He had arrived expecting to apply logic to chaos. Instead, he had discovered that some forms of chaos could not be ordered, only endured with courage and hope. Mora recovered over the following weeks. She emerged from the Bacta tank diminished but determined. Her connection to the Force had been damaged by the Inquisitor's attack, her ability to sense and manipulate it reduced to a fraction of what it had been. She could no longer fight as she once had, but she could still teach. She resumed Spock's training with quiet intensity, focusing on mental discipline and force perception rather than combat applications. Spock learned quickly. His analytical mind, once a barrier to force sensitivity, became an asset. He approached the Force as he would any complex system: identify variables, test hypotheses, observe results. Mora said it was an unorthodox method but effective. The Force responded to intention more than technique. If Spock's intention was to understand, the Force would teach him. He began to integrate his abilities into his strategic work. He used Force-enhanced perception to identify patterns in Imperial communications. He sensed deception in intelligence reports, subtle inconsistencies that revealed enemy disinformation campaigns. His recommendations to Admiral Kor became more accurate, his insights more profound. The rebellion benefited measurably from his contributions. But Spock remained troubled. The dark side's whisper had not faded. It returned in moments of stress or anger, offering power as a solution to intractable problems. He discussed this with Mora. She said the dark side's temptation never truly disappeared. It was part of the Force's nature, the shadow cast by light. The key was not to eliminate the temptation but to acknowledge it without surrendering. Balance. Always balance. 6 months after the convoy raid, the Alliance received intelligence that changed everything. The Emperor himself would be traveling to inspect the superweapon facility, now nearing completion despite the rebels' sabotage efforts. His presence represented an opportunity that might never come again. If they could strike while he was vulnerable, they could decapitate the Empire's leadership. The war might end in a single stroke. General Sornay called an emergency council. Every senior officer attended, the briefing room packed with personnel. Admiral Kor presented the intelligence, the Emperor's route, his escort strength, the facility's defenses. The numbers were daunting. The Emperor traveled with a fleet of star destroyers and a personal guard of elite troops. The facility itself bristled with weapons, emplacements, and fighter squadrons. A direct assault would be annihilated. Spock had been studying the problem for 72 hours. He had analyzed every variable, modeled every scenario, consulted with Mora about the Force's potential influence. Now he presented his conclusions. The assault could not succeed through conventional means, but if they combined unconventional tactics with Force-guided precision, they might achieve what appeared impossible. The plan had 3 phases. First, a small team would infiltrate the facility ahead of the Emperor's arrival, sabotaging key systems and creating vulnerabilities. Second, the main fleet would engage the Imperial escort in the system's outer reaches, drawing forces away from the facility. Third, a strike team would penetrate the facility during the chaos and either capture or eliminate the Emperor. It was audacious to the point of insanity. Admiral Kor said as much. She enumerated the risks. The infiltration team could be discovered. The fleet could be destroyed before completing its diversion. The strike team could fail to reach the Emperor. Each phase depended on improbable success. Spock agreed with her assessment. He noted, however, that their current trajectory led to inevitable defeat. The Empire's industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm them. A high-risk operation that offered a chance of decisive victory was strategically preferable to slow attrition. General Sorn asked for probability of success. Spock calculated in real time, factoring in every known variable and assigning weighted values to unknowns. The result was stark, 11%. Sorn stared at the number in silence. Then he asked Spock if he would participate in the mission personally. Spock said he would lead the infiltration team. His Force sensitivity would help them evade detection. Mora objected immediately. She said Spock's training was incomplete, that facing the Emperor or his Inquisitors would result in certain death. Spock acknowledged the risk, but noted that his death carried no greater weight than anyone else's. Mora's expression was pained. She said his death would carry great weight to those who had come to value him. The room fell silent. Spock found himself momentarily without words. He had not considered that his presence might matter to these people beyond his utility. It was an error in judgment, a failure to account for the emotional bonds that had formed despite his intentions. He looked around the room and saw faces he recognized. Kes, who had led him into his first ground assault. Tarek, who had navigated them through hyperspace with seemingly impossible precision. Then, who had risked everything to help them root out a traitor. They were not merely colleagues. They were, by any reasonable definition, his companions, perhaps even friends, though he had not allowed himself to acknowledge it. The realization shifted something in his understanding. The Alliance was not simply a military organization. It was a community bound by shared purpose and mutual care. His contributions mattered not just tactically but personally. He told Mora he would still go, not because his death was meaningless, but because their lives, all their lives, were worth the risk. If there was even a small chance of ending this war and preventing future suffering, he had to take it. It was the logical choice. It was also the compassionate one. Perhaps, for once, logic and compassion aligned. General Sawney approved the mission. Preparation began immediately. The infiltration team would consist of Spock, Kes, Vixis the Slicer, and 2 commandos selected for their expertise in hostile environment operations. They would travel in a captured Imperial shuttle, using forged credentials to bypass security checkpoints. Once inside the facility, they would plant charges on critical systems, power generators, shield emitters, and the docking bay that would receive the Emperor's shuttle. The charges would detonate during the fleet engagement, creating chaos. Meanwhile, the strike team would insert via a stolen Imperial assault craft. Their target was the Emperor's throne room, deep within the facility. The team would include Mora, despite her diminished abilities, and a squad of the Alliance's best soldiers. They would have minutes to reach the Emperor before his guards could respond. Spock spent the days before launch in meditation. He refined his force perception, practicing techniques to remain undetected by hostile force users. Mora worked with him tirelessly, teaching him to create what she called a force shadow, a technique that masked one's presence by blending with the ambient energy. It was difficult and exhausting, but Spock's analytical approach allowed him to maintain it longer than most students. He also prepared emotionally. He recorded a message for his colleagues, to be delivered if he did not return. In it, he expressed gratitude for their acceptance and respect for their courage. He noted that serving alongside them had expanded his understanding of what it meant to live with purpose. The message felt inadequate, words too small for the sentiment, but it was all he could offer. The fleet assembled in a nameless system 3 days from the target. 62 ships, everything the Alliance could spare without leaving other sectors defenseless. It was a fraction of the Empire's strength, but it represented hope distilled into metal and determination. Admiral Kor addressed the fleet via holocom, her words simple and direct. They were going to strike at the heart of tyranny. Many would not return, but those who did would carry the memory of this day forever. The fleet jumped to hyperspace in waves. Spock's infiltration team went first, their shuttle dropping out near the facility 48 hours ahead of the main assault. The facility hung in space like a mechanical tumor, its asteroid shell carved into chambers and corridors. Sensor arrays tracked every ship in the system. Weapon platforms stood ready to obliterate threats. And somewhere inside, the superweapon neared completion. The shuttle transmitted its credentials. An Imperial controller responded, her voice bored and officious. She demanded their authorization codes and purpose. Vixis provided the codes they had sliced from captured databases, his tone perfectly matching Imperial bureaucratic tedium. The controller verified the codes. She directed them to Docking Bay 73 for inspection. Spock felt the force ripple with danger. He warned the team. Inquisitors were present in the facility. They would need to maintain their force shadows constantly. Any slip would alert the enemy. Kes acknowledged, her face grim. She had seen what Inquisitors could do. The shuttle landed in the designated bay. Inspection teams approached with scanners and datapads. Vixis had prepared for this. He activated a scrambler hidden in the shuttle's systems, one that would fuzz their sensor readings just enough to obscure anomalies. The inspectors scanned the ship, found nothing suspicious, and cleared them for entry. The team disembarked, wearing stolen Imperial uniforms that fit poorly but passed casual inspection. They split into 2 groups. Kes and the commandos headed for the power generators. Spock and Vixis made for the shield emitters. They moved through corridors thick with personnel, engineers, technicians, stormtroopers. Spock maintained his Force shadow, blending into the background of the facility's energy signature. It was like walking a tightrope while blindfolded, every step requiring absolute concentration. They reached the shield control room after 37 minutes. A pair of guards stood outside. Vixis approached, datapad in hand, claiming he needed to run diagnostics. The guards checked his credentials and waved him through. Spock followed, keeping his presence minimal. Inside, technicians monitored displays that showed shield status across the facility. Vixis began his work, inserting a data spike that would allow remote detonation of charges they would plant later. Spock felt a presence approaching. Dark, cold, familiar. An Inquisitor, moving through the facility on patrol. Spock deepened his Force shadow, becoming as still as stone. The presence passed their location, pausing briefly before continuing. Spock released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Vixis finished his work. They exited the control room and rendezvoused with Kes. The charges were planted over the next 6 hours. Each one carefully hidden, each one timed to detonate simultaneously. They avoided patrols through a combination of Spock's Force perception and the team's tactical experience. By the time they completed the sabotage, exhaustion had settled into Spock's bones. Maintaining the Force shadow for extended periods drained him in ways physical exertion never had. They returned to their shuttle and waited. The Emperor would arrive in 18 hours. The fleet would attack 12 hours later. Until then, they could only sit in the dark and prepare for what came next. Spock meditated, conserving his strength. Kes cleaned her weapons. Vixis reviewed his detonation protocols. The commandos slept in shifts, their breathing steady and controlled. The hours crawled past. Then the Emperor arrived. Spock felt his presence like a wound in the Force, a void so deep it seemed to devour light itself. This was power beyond anything he had encountered, beyond the Inquisitor, beyond even what he had imagined possible. The Emperor's shuttle descended toward the facility's primary docking bay, escorted by TIE interceptors and flanked by elite guards. Spock extended his awareness carefully. He touched the edges of the Emperor's presence and recoiled instantly. It was like pressing his hand against a furnace. The dark side radiated from the Emperor in waves, corrupting everything it touched. Spock felt nausea rise in his throat. He understood now why the Jedi had called the Sith an abomination. This was not merely the use of the dark side. This was the dark side made flesh. The fleet engagement began precisely on schedule. Rebel ships dropped from hyperspace at the system's edge, their weapons blazing. Star destroyers turned to meet them, their massive hulls lumbering into position. TIE fighters swarmed like locusts. The battle was visible, even from within the facility. Flashes of light in the distance, the glow of explosions painting the void. Spock activated the charges. They detonated in sequence, each explosion carefully calculated to maximize disruption without causing catastrophic structural failure. Power flickered throughout the facility, shields collapsed, alarms wailed. Personnel scrambled to respond, thinking they were under attack from within. In the chaos, Mora's strike team launched. Their assault craft screamed toward the facility's breached hull. Spock monitored their progress through the Force, feeling Mora's determination and the strike team's fear. They penetrated the facility through a hole blown in the docking bay. Stormtroopers engaged them immediately, blaster fire turning the corridors into kill zones. The strike team fought with desperate precision, advancing meter by bloody meter. Spock and his infiltration team moved to support them. They could not reach Mora's position directly, but they could create additional diversions. Kes led them through service tunnels, placing additional charges and opening airlocks to vent sections of the facility. Each action pulled Imperial forces away from the strike team's route, but the Inquisitors were converging. Spock felt them moving through the facility like sharks drawn to blood. 3 of them, possibly more. They sensed the Force users among the attackers and moved to eliminate them. Spock knew Mora could not stand against them in her weakened state. He made a decision. He told Kes to continue supporting the strike team. He would draw the Inquisitors away. Kes objected. She said that was suicide. Spock agreed, but noted that his death would be tactically valuable if it allowed the strike team to reach the Emperor. Kes stared at him, her jaw tight. Then she nodded. She understood the mathematics of sacrifice. Spock moved through the facility alone. He dropped his Force shadow deliberately, allowing his presence to shine like a beacon. The Inquisitors turned toward him immediately. He felt their attention lock onto his position, their hunger for Force-sensitive prey overriding other considerations. He ran, leading them away from the strike team's route, deeper into the facility's maze of corridors. They pursued with terrifying speed. Spock used every advantage he possessed. His knowledge of the facility's layout from stolen schematics, his Force-enhanced reflexes, his ability to anticipate their movements through the Force. He was not a warrior. He was a scientist, playing a deadly game of probability and prediction. The first Inquisitor caught him in a storage bay. She was lithe and fast, her lightsaber a crimson blur. Spock had no weapon that could match her blade. He used the Force instead, hurling cargo containers at her with telekinetic force. She deflected them effortlessly, advancing with patient inevitability. Spock retreated, calculating angles and distances, searching for any advantage. He found it in the bay's power conduits. With a focused burst of telekinesis, he ruptured the main conduit. Electricity arced through the chamber, wild and deadly. The Inquisitor leaped clear, but her concentration broke for an instant. Spock used that instant to flee, sealing the bay door behind him. 2 more Inquisitors waited in the corridor beyond. They attacked in perfect coordination, their lightsabers weaving patterns of light and death. Spock had seconds before they would cut him down. He reached into the Force with everything he had, not to attack but to shield. He created a barrier of pure Force energy, a technique Mora had mentioned but never demonstrated. The barrier held for 3.2 seconds. Then it shattered. Spock was thrown backward, his body slamming into a bulkhead. Pain exploded through his ribs. He tasted blood. The Inquisitors advanced for the kill. Spock prepared himself for death, his mind strangely calm. He had bought time, that was enough. Then Mora arrived. She came through a side passage, her diminished lightsaber igniting with defiant green light. She positioned herself between Spock and the Inquisitors, her stance perfect despite her injuries. She told them they would not touch him. The Inquisitors laughed. They recognized her, a broken Jedi, a relic of a dead order. What could she hope to accomplish? Mora showed them. She fought with Form Third's absolute defense, her blade always where it needed to be, never wasting movement. She could not attack, her strength was too diminished for that, but she could protect. And protect she did, deflecting every strike, absorbing every assault. The Inquisitors grew frustrated. They unleashed the dark side, Force lightning, telekinetic barrages, psychological attacks meant to break her will. Mora endured. Spock struggled to his feet, his ribs screaming protest. He could not fight as she did, but he could help. He reached out through the Force, not to attack the Inquisitors but to support Mora. He lent her his strength, his calm, his analytical precision. Together, they formed something neither could achieve alone: balance. The Inquisitors faltered. They were not accustomed to prey that fought back with both passion and logic, emotion and reason intertwined. Their attacks became less coordinated. Mora seized an opening. Her lightsaber found flesh. One Inquisitor fell, his mask clattering to the deck. The others retreated, reassessing. Then the facility shook. The strike team had reached the Emperor's throne room. Spock felt it through the Force, a confrontation of such magnitude it warped reality around it. The Emperor's power met the combined might of the strike team's Force users and elite soldiers. The conflict was brief and terrible, and then, impossibly, Spock felt the Emperor's presence waver. Someone had wounded him. The Inquisitors felt it too. They abandoned their pursuit of Spock and Mora, racing toward the throne room. Mora started to follow, but Spock stopped her. He said their role was complete. The strike team would either succeed or fail regardless of their intervention. They needed to escape while the facility descended into chaos. Mora hesitated, then agreed. They made their way back to the shuttle, moving through corridors thick with smoke and panic. Imperial personnel ran in every direction, some trying to fight fires, others abandoning their posts. The facility was dying, torn apart by explosions, and the force battle raging at its heart. They reached the docking bay to find Kess and the infiltration team already aboard. The shuttle launched immediately, its engines straining against the facility's decaying artificial gravity. Behind them, the structure began to collapse, sections imploding as power systems failed catastrophically. TIE fighters swarmed everywhere, some still fighting rebels, others simply trying to escape. Spock watched through the viewport as the facility tore itself apart. He felt the moment the Emperor's presence vanished from the Force. Not extinguished, he was too powerful for that, but retreating, wounded and diminished. The strike team had failed to kill him, but they had hurt him. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the myth of his invincibility was more important than the man himself. The shuttle jumped to hyperspace. They rendezvoused with the fleet 2 days later. The cost had been terrible. 41 ships lost, thousands dead. But they had achieved something unprecedented. They had struck the Emperor himself and lived. Word would spread across the galaxy. The Empire was not invincible. Rebellion was not futile. Admiral Kor met them in the hangar, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. She reported the butcher's bill. The strike team had been annihilated to the last soldier. But before they died, they had delivered a wound the Emperor would not soon forget. One of the team had been a Force user, untrained but powerful. In his final moments, he had channeled every ounce of strength into a single attack, shattering the Emperor's defenses long enough for conventional weapons to strike home. The Empire would call it a terrorist attack. The Rebellion would call it a victory. Spock called it war. He spent the following weeks helping to rebuild. The Alliance's losses were severe, but new recruits flooded in, inspired by the mission's success. Systems that had remained neutral declared for the rebellion. Imperial governors defected, bringing resources and intelligence. The balance of the war shifted incrementally but measurably. Spock continued his work with Admiral Kor. But something had changed. He no longer approached strategy as a purely intellectual exercise. He considered the people who would carry out each mission, the families who would mourn each loss. His recommendations became more conservative, prioritizing preservation of life alongside tactical objectives. Kor noticed and approved. Mora's injuries never fully healed. She could no longer fight, her connection to the Force too damaged. But she could still teach, and she did so with renewed purpose. Spock remained her student, though increasingly they learned from each other. She taught him Force techniques. He taught her to see the Force through the lens of science, to understand its patterns and probabilities. Together, they were forging something new. Not Jedi. Not Sith. Something that honored both logic and compassion, both reason and faith. Spock did not know if it would survive beyond them. But it existed now, in this moment, and that was enough. 6 months after the mission, Spock stood on the observation deck of the Redemption's light. The fleet drifted in the void, preparing for the next operation, the next battle in an endless war. Spock watched the stars and thought about the path that had brought him here. He had not chosen this war. He had not asked to be stranded in a galaxy where mysticism held power and hope defied logic. But he had found something unexpected. Purpose, community, a cause worth fighting for. He would never return to his universe, his life as it had been. That future was gone. But perhaps, in losing what he had known, he had gained something more valuable, a chance to become more than he had been. The Force whispered around him, neither light nor dark, but something in between. Balance. He had spent his life pursuing logic's perfection. Now he understood that perfection was an illusion. The truth lay in the tension between opposites, the space where reason met emotion, where science encountered faith. The galaxy was vast and chaotic and filled with contradictions, and he would help bring it peace, one calculation at a time.